So welcome all to today's daily academic roundup. As I've explained yesterday and the day before, this is a more informal session where a couple of academics look back at today's activities at the World Investment Forum and go a bit deeper into certain topics. It's my great pleasure to have with me today Rob Gross, who is professor at the Thunderbird School of Global Management. He also is a past president of the Academy of International Business and an AIB fellow. My name is Ari Van Ash. I'm professor of international business at HEC Montreal in Canada and the deputy editor for the Journal of International Business Policy. So the way this is going to work is that we're both going to give our first initial thoughts about what happened today. We'll do this in a bit slanted way, given that we're both located in the United States and Canada, which means that the earliest sessions were a bit harder for us to follow. And then what we're going to do is we're going to also open up the floor to anybody that might have questions online. So the whole idea is that you can decide in which direction we're going with the comments you're giving. So maybe I can start, Rob. So I did have the chance actually to watch a couple of quite a couple of sessions today. So we had a whole lot of very high profile and sessions of different tracks. So in the academic track, we just finished the academic closing panel where Rob Gross was on as well. And so this was a panel where Richard Bolwijn and others really were pushing leading researchers to think about future research related to investing into sustainability. Before that, we had another more academic panel on developing future-proof global value chains as well. And then besides that, we also had a whole lot of other high-level, more practitioner panels. So, of course, we had the ministerial roundtable where we had various ministers from different countries pointing out what for them were priorities in investing in sustainability. There was a very interesting session on the G20 and investments. So the G20 meetings will be taking place next week, I believe. And so, of course, for all these meetings, there's a lot of work that goes on before. And so there was a discussion about what the T20 has been proposing for discussion in the G20 meeting, which was very interesting. There were some sessions that were in collaboration with other international organizations. There was a session on decent work and special economic zones together with the ILO. And there was a very interesting session that where I only saw the end of in collaboration with the World Health Organization, which was really on how to prepare for future pandemics. And one of the points that was really made there was that there is a need for the development of production capacity in Africa. And so this is also something that I think is very interesting. What is interesting in all these sessions is that there were a number of themes that constantly came back. One theme, of course, that came back all the time was sustainability, because that's what this year's World Investment Forum is about. Another one, though, that got a lot of attention is resiliency. And undergirding a lot of the discussion was that, of course, we need to strengthen resiliency and sustainability, but the question is how to do this. And an important related question is, do we need more economic globalization to reach more resiliency and sustainability, or do we need to have less of it? So this is something that we can certainly explore a bit further later on. Another question that is related to it is, can we, if we do need more economic globalization, can we actually generate more international cooperation given the current landscape? Even before the pandemic hits, we were already seeing more geopolitical turbulence emerging. The pandemic certainly has also led to certain trust issues falling apart. And so one of the questions is, can we find the right collaboration, international collaboration between countries in order to develop the required economic globalization for resiliency and sustainability? I do want to, before I'm going to pass on the word to Rob, mention a couple of things about resiliency. And I've got some notes here that I was thinking about as I was listening to the different presentations. So resiliency is a really hot topic. And it's obvious why resiliency is such an important topic. Ever since the pandemic has occurred, we have been hit by questions about resiliency time and again. It started off with the shortages in personal productive equipment in the early months of the pandemic. Next, we saw the blockage of the Suez Canal, where again, there was questions about the resiliency of the global transportation system. Now we're talking about more widespread supply chain woes in Great Britain and the United States and in other places. And there's been a lot of people that have been proposing that all of this is simply an indication that globalization and global value chains have become too complex, that perhaps some countries have become overly dependent on countries like China, and that perhaps global value chains were not built for the world of geopolitical turbulence that we're seeing right now. And so as a result of that, you hear many people saying, okay, look, what we need to see is global value chains becoming shorter, more reshoring occurring, more diversification of suppliers, perhaps more toward friendly countries. But ultimately, you hear this underlying narrative that perhaps global value chains might be the culprits of a lot of things that are happening. And I would like to take a couple of minutes here to push back a little bit on this. And I want to make 3 points. The first point I want to make is that while of course there is a link between resiliency and global supply chains, the link is not unidirectional. Yes, of course, we all can think of certain events that have happened in another country that led to shortages here through global supply chains. And so in 2011, I think when the Tohoku earthquake emerged, at that moment, because you could not produce certain chips in Japan, as a result of that, there was a shortage in computers in Canada. That's kind of an example that everybody can relate to. One thing that people don't focus sufficiently on, though, is that a lot of companies actually create global value chains exactly because it allows them to develop more agility against certain shocks. There's right now a lot of talk about companies developing a China plus one strategy, but this is actually something that companies have been doing for quite a while, so that if there is a certain shock occurring in China, you can actually source something from another country as well. So the issue that globalizing value chains means that you are increasing your exposure to risks of shocks, that is, from theory speaking and empirical evidence, just not the case. And one example that I certainly like to use in this respect is the COVID-19 pandemic. So we all remember what happened in the first couple of months of the pandemic. In a lot of places, factories stopped. We were no longer able to travel. We had to stay at home and all these things. And despite the fact that we had this very real disruption in the system, because we actually had global trade going on, we actually did not see too many shortages emerging, besides, of course, the ones that got a lot of attention, which is the example of these medical masks and other medical equipment. So that's kind of the first thing I wanted to indicate. The second point I would like to make is that when we see global supply chain disruptions, we need to be very careful in identifying what the origin of this disruption is. We like to immediately say, well, we cannot see it in the store, this means that something must have happened internationally that has driven this. In reality, actually, there can be many reasons why you get certain shortages. Again, if we go back to the shortages of N95 masks in the early 2020, yes, of course, we heard that there were temporary export restrictions by certain countries, but they never lasted more than a couple of days. Yes, there were certain fights on the tarmac in Shanghai to be able to get the masks onto a certain plane. That got a lot of attention too. But the real reason why we had these shortages was simply that we had a global pandemic that hit the entire world at the same time. And so everybody who did not use masks before now suddenly wanted a large number of masks. So there was an explosion in demand all around the globe, and global capacity of mask production just could not follow. So even if we would have been in a situation where every country was making their own masks, we still would have had the same shortages going on. So we have to also here be quite careful in how we're identifying what the source of the shortages is. Even right now with the supply chain shortages, people are pointing out that indeed blockages and lineups at ports are important, but also the fact that right now we are consuming very differently than a couple of years ago. The final thing I want to say is that given that indeed resiliency is not unambiguously related to increasingly international supply chains, we have to be very careful in thinking about how to develop resiliency. So there are issues related to resiliency. We have to be thinking about this. Countries need to develop stress tests to really think about how to strengthen resiliency for key essential products. But ultimately, what we need to take into account is that in order to develop this resiliency, we need to embrace global supply chains and not reject it. It doesn't mean that these global supply chains need to have the same form as they have right now, but if we always start localizing everything, things would become very expensive and not necessarily more resilient. And secondly, what is also really important is that we need to embrace international cooperation. And here I will get back to a point that the president of the Academy of International Business, Faro Contractor, pointed out in the previous session, which is probably if we want to ensure that the world becomes more resilient and more sustainable, we need to have more economic globalization. What he means with that is not that we should be having the same globalization that we had in the past, but what he means is that we need to have more international cooperation to make sure that we can create the processes and mechanisms that allows us to develop the resiliency that we need. Unfortunately, right now, we're facing a lot of political pressure within countries against this, and we have to make sure that we think about how to address these political pressures as well. I'll stop here because I do want to give some time to Rob as well. And in the meantime, if at any moment there is any questions from the audience, pushback or anything like that, please just put it in the chat. Rob, up to you.
Okay, thank you, Ari. Well, I've been able to participate in, I guess, the 2 AIB sessions today, but I was not able to get up earlier and watch the 4:00 a.m. sessions that were staged or based, I guess, in Abu Dhabi, at least time-wise. But I saw the AIB session this morning and the one just before this one, and so I can report a little bit to you on what I heard and how I interpret some of what was discussed. So one issue is something that Ari's already talked about briefly on the global value chain efficiency versus resilience. And I think that a point that's useful to make, and actually somebody else made it as well as me, that resilience is just another label for risk management. What companies need to do and have needed to do for many years, if not forever, is to try and keep their costs down or aim to minimize costs, but also aim to minimize risks. And you can't serve both masters at the same time, but you can try to reduce costs, you can try to reduce risks. But I remember when I worked as an external instructor for IBM quite a few years ago, they always demanded that we have 2 instructors for every content piece that was being presented, so that if one person got sick, there was a second alternative. And I mean, this is just a super simple example, but this is the way IBM works. They always demand at least 2 suppliers of anything. And this is for decades, not as a result of the pandemic or deglobalization or anything in recent years. Anyway, with respect to the efficiency versus resilience, I think there's no reason to expect reshoring. And we didn't really talk much about that today. Maybe that came up earlier in the week. But, the discussion has been going around about moving production back to the United States or to Western Europe from Africa, Latin America, Asia, principally Asia. Hasn't happened as a result of the pandemic or as a result of the supposed deglobalization. And the idea is that companies are finding alternative sources. If there's a breakdown in production, if there's an earthquake or a typhoon, the way Ari was talking about a natural disaster a minute ago, then you look for an alternative supplier once yours is knocked offline for a while. But it doesn't mean you change the entire value chain, except to expand the number of suppliers. And Farrokh had a nice picture of the costs and benefits of having more suppliers, which then raises the unit cost from for the company that's purchasing inputs wherever they're from, rather than having one best optimal supplier, which would of course be most desirable, except when there's a breakdown. And the Taylor guitar example was really terrific. Scott Paul talked about how his company buys wood from different countries, and I guess during COVID, but even before that, just with changes in regulations and changes in global demand, they've worked with wood suppliers in Africa. He said Cameroon, and I forget the other country, and in California where they're based. And they, use multiple suppliers for quite a while, meaning a couple at least, just like my IBM example. But recently in California, they've been buying waste wood from cities and, reconfiguring that to be wood that they can use in making their guitars. And they are also following a policy of replanting trees in the locations where they buy the wood. It's clearly in line with the sustainable development goals, but it's something that just made sense to them, which is really fascinating for me as an IB person. The question, though, is, Ari, how come we still have shortages of Clorox wipes and Ritz bits? But maybe one of the people in the audience can answer that. A second issue that came up today was a discussion of foreign direct investment and social implications. And we talked about inequality and gender in particular. I mean, inequality is a huge issue, and I didn't hear very much really discussed today. But, we talk in the United States about the very skewed distribution of income. The 1% of people control whatever it is, 40% of financial assets in the United States. I mean, this is extreme. And what do you do about it? But it's not just the US. It's in China, it's in Latin American countries, it's in Western Europe, and so on. So what about the inequality issue? How does foreign direct investment affect it? How can foreign direct investment maybe be channeled to improve better income and wealth distribution? It's a big challenge. There's not a simple answer there, but it's one that governments and agencies like the IMF and World Bank and WTO can potentially attack. Jennifer Poole talked about gender bias, and she didn't have a conclusion for us about how direct investment can be used to promote female empowerment through policy, but at least she raised the issue, and it's one that we can talk about further. And it's very likely that direct investment is going to be pushed by social institutions, NGOs, and other pressure groups to comply with the Sustainable Development Goals, not just one that has to do with gender or poverty, but the others as well. Another issue that came up today is with respect to governance of multinationals. Governance is changing, not just government regulation, but governance of the companies from within. As companies cross borders, in recent years, there have been government-owned companies, SOEs, state-owned enterprises, but also sovereign wealth funds that invest internationally in companies. And how do you regulate a government government owner of a company if you're the government yourself, or it's the government that's the owner? There's not an easy answer to that. And you've got other pools of money that are being put together in private equity and in funds in general that are investing in companies where there's no knowledge of the business in particular, but there's an attractive company. And instead of foreign direct investment, we're seeing private equity, or we're seeing funds actually buy companies. Think of Kohlberg, Kravis, and Roberts as the biggest group doing. I think they're the biggest group doing that these days. So those are some issues with respect to governance that are not traditional ones that we've talked about. We heard regional perspectives today from Asia, Middle East, and Africa, and Latin America. The Asia one focused on several things, but particularly on technology and its transfer to other countries. Technology is being developed faster in the United States, or more investment is taking place in the US than anywhere else. But China is closing the gap and is far ahead of Japan and other countries in investment in R&D. So where is new technology being developed, and how is it being transferred to other countries, particularly in emerging markets? And the discussion of the Middle East I thought was fascinating, because the comment was, there has been a great example of economic development success in the United Arab Emirates. And I was dean of a business school at the American University there for a few years, 5 or 6 years ago. And it's true, the Dubai's success, or the Emirates' success, has been spectacular. But how much of a model is that for other countries where you have one sheikh or 2 or 3 sheikhs, meaning autocratic rulers, who make all the decisions? And if you disagree with them, you can leave the country, but you have no rights as a foreigner in particular, but even as an Emirati in a general sense. So how happy are we with that kind of authoritarian rule, even though it's very successful? And look at China as an even better example, bringing whatever it is, 400 million or 500 million people out of poverty in the last 30 years. I mean, that's the most spectacular success story in the history of the world. Do we want to all copy that governance structure? And I think the answer is clearly no. So what do you do? And I don't have a good answer. In Latin America, the last one I didn't mention yet, as far as regions go, countries are challenged by anti-democratic leaders, right and left. Well, mostly left, but still, no, actually a good mix of right and left. If I think of Venezuela on the left, and Brazil, and Brazil, Bolsonaro on the right. So the issues are anti-democratic leadership. How do you deal with that? Especially if you're a company? How do you deal with the challenge you face when the populist or anti-democratic leader of the country, or the party that's in power, is anti-business? So we didn't talk about that in those words, but that's a real challenge out there for multinational firms. We talked about the deglobalization myth. I've got 2 more points to make here, Ari. We talked about the deglobalization myth, and Furrow Contractor has an article in Jibs that Ari mentioned. I have an article in the Management International Review, another one that should come out in AIB Insights pretty soon, showing that globalization has not reversed at all, but rather slowed down a bit. And this is probably not news to most AIB people these days, but it's certainly news to the semi-informed public that thinks the world is going, or that direct investment and trade are going down the drain with protectionism, which is simply factually not true. We talked about, or Ugo Panizza talked about, foreign direct investment being questionable as it relates, the relationship between direct investment and GDP growth being questionable. Does direct investment contribute to GDP growth or not? And there have been some studies in the last 7 or 8 years that show that direct investment, coupled with different additional elements such as democracy or participation in regional and international trade agreements, does make a difference, but by itself is insignificant, at least statistically. So what do we say about that issue? That's quite a challenge to our orthodoxy in AIB, I would say. And then my final theme is that we're facing a world today which is characterized governance-wise by dual hegemons, the United States and China. And while you may be pro or con either country, the United States in nominal terms still is the largest economy in the world, but China is catching up and is likely to pass the United States in terms of total GDP in the next 5 years. And in terms of personal income or family income or whatever you want to call that measure of individual well-being, the United States is far, far, far ahead, as are Western European countries, Japan, and a number of others, far ahead of China. And that gap's not likely to be eliminated in the next 30 or 40 years, although maybe eventually it will be. But the point is, China is huge. China has tremendous economic power with the Belt and Road Initiative and their attempt to have an Asian IMF and an Asian Development Bank, AIB. They're setting up institutions and putting money in play that are attracting additional countries to their sphere of influence. So how is this going to play out in terms of company interests and in terms of company dealings with governments in the world? So I don't see this as going to lead, by the way, to World War III or some kind of catastrophic end. I think there's the possibility of having a stable dual hegemony, okay? I don't think there's any need to have a single hegemon, which historically in the international political economy literature has been argued, at least as a sine qua non. You can't have more than one. And it seems like we do. And it seems like, to me anyway, there may be a gradual transition between hegemons, but gradual over 50 years or so, not in the next 10 or 20 years. But it's fascinating to look at different aspects of the dual hegemony and how it affects companies and us, of course, as people and as academics as well. So there are some thoughts from today's discussion, and I look forward to our interaction now. Thanks, everybody, and thanks, Ari.
Thanks, Rob. So some people talk about dual hegemonies, and others talk about a G0 world where there is no leaders anymore.
No, that's not right.
So let me actually bring in Amelia Santos Paulino right now. So Amelia is, first of all, the person who organized these daily academic roundups, but also the chief of the investment issues sections of UNCTAD. Amelia, welcome to the session.
Many thanks. And first, thank you and thanks, Rob, for the brilliant summary of what happened at the WIF, and especially to Rob, because he couldn't have tell you better. I mean, his concise but very eloquent summary of the issues discussed was perfect. I just want to go back to the issue that that he mentioned about not having a concrete response on the impact of FDI on gender and on inequalities. And before I go into the gender question, I do agree that we need to do more on the inequality front. There is a lot of literature on trade and this transmission of trade through the labor market mechanisms, but in FDI and inequality, there is less of an understanding. That's why we started this project, and we have this publication where we try to see, I mean, FDI, multinationals invest abroad, but they don't only bring foreign direct investment, they bring their own cultural norms and policies and practices. So what we try to do, because we don't have a perfect measure of this transmission mechanism, is how to look at how MNEs can affect gender equality in the host country, directly through employment practices in foreign affiliates and indirectly through spillovers in local level markets, similar to what we do in trade. So basically the direct effect is documented. We have seen a lot of papers looking at impact of FDI on employment opportunities, and we see the difference between level of skills. What we look here is the difference between the adoption of practices, especially non-discriminatory practices in the labor market of the host countries, like sort of trying to copy good practices. But the issue is that not always happen, because it also depends on the local environment and the type of investment laws. So basically, we try to see how much these practices of equality in hiring, policies, pay and promotion, and opportunities across the network of affiliates happen or not. And for us, this will be the first, like the starting point to measure an impact. So to look at these policies and practices. We had a framework that we tried to follow. So basically, we look at the sort of labor market, global and local. I mean, global meaning the home country of the MNEs, and the host country. We look at human rights issues, we look at empowerment and so on. But the way that we manage to see is what are the mechanisms. So we look at supply chain impact, like those firms that hire women and that are part of value chains, the issue of competition between foreign firms and local firms, and technology, whether firms that attract FDI and they are more intense in technology, what is the impact on gender, and the issue of labor mobility. So we found that for some countries, the local adoption of technologies favor female participation. So in the case of Vietnam, the more technology intense areas that attracted FDI in technology-intensive sectors had a positive impact on gender. In Costa Rica, we saw positive spillover from the M&E sector, that is the IT mostly sector, to local. And then the case of labor mobility in other countries was not so clear. It's not easy so easy to move from the foreign sector to the domestic sector. So I think this is a starting point. What still we have more to do is the issue of reporting by M&Es. Reporting on these standards. Still, there is a long way to go. We started in the World Investment Report to look at the rate, how much top 100 multinationals report on these issues. There is a gap, but it's a starting point. So I think a way of tackling through the crossroad between international business, trade and development, literature and investment is to look at these standards and how they affect labor markets. And another important point is that the policies and the consumer pressures of the home country also matters for this type of how M&Es behave abroad. So I think there is some very important take-up points there, and I think we can do more in this line of research. Thank you, Ari.
Very good, Amelia. I thought, sorry, Ari, I'll jump in for just a second. Yes. I think that the issue of the policies of the home company kind of chasing the companies, the policies of the home country chasing the companies as they go overseas, has really been borne out over time. And I think of the United States Foreign Corrupt Practices Act of 1977, which drew laughter and ridicule from other countries and from companies based outside the United States for a couple of decades. And now we see by the year 2000 that most countries, emerging markets as well as Western Europe, do have Foreign Corrupt Practices Act equivalents or some kind of legislation to try and reduce this problem of corruption. And so, the policy that was so crazy in the United States, or appeared that way, has been taken up. And I think that's a fantastic result, which demonstrates that you can carry policies from an innovative or a forward-looking, whatever you want to call it, home country, and diffuse them throughout the world and get the multinational companies first, but then local companies as well, to step up their game in the direction of, if you will, the sustainable development goals. So I think that's really terrific.
No, and if you allow me, Ari, I just jump in. This is where investment promotion agencies have a role to play, because if you have outward promotion policies, incentive policies for M&Es to behave well abroad, then these incentives can be tied to certain performance, like what are your labor policies abroad? How do you comply? Do you behave in Bangladesh as you behave in the Netherlands, or just two opposite examples? Not that they have. So I think this is where investment policies matter. Also, the creation of linkages programs, and I mean, there are policy tools there that the home country can, and all this environmental social governance umbrella and this UN compact has helped a bit with this, but there is a long way to go. And I think for me, again, we touch on the issue of data at the closing panel, and microdata and granular data, but reporting is important, and reporting not only at the corporate level, but also what happened at the middle and plant workers level, I think is important too. And another tool that we have at hand, and thanks Ari for a recommendation to having Mary Frank in the gender panel, it was the issue of bilateral investment agreement and trade agreements, the provisions for gender issues on not only on trade agreements. Canada is leader on the gender agreement last year with the US, Canada, Mexico, but there are other countries like are starting, like Chile and some regional compacts. So there are tools out there, and they have been more analyzed on the trade. There was a question at the closing panel if we have measured the impact of trade, but the impact of investment can be measured, and there are tools as well. I'll stop here. Thank you.
No, thank you very much. So I think both of you are pointing out new creative ways how governments are trying to promote social standards and environmental stewardship throughout global value chains, and some things that are different. So, for example, Rob, you mentioned the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and that was mostly focusing on activities within your firm boundaries. Now there are pressures to make multinational firms or elite firms responsible for things that are happening outside of their firm activities as well. And indeed, as Amelia was pointing out, right now there is increasing thinking about how perhaps investment promotion or foreign investment attraction can be linked to certain social or environmental standards as well. The question then, of course, so this is really great that these things are being done, and it's certainly something to be commended. Of course, it requires us to think how all this then fits into the existing global trade landscape and trade rules, and whether or not these global trade rules need to be adjusted as well. So the World Trade Organization, by the end of the year, will be having a big meeting where they're trying to rethink a bit what their role can be. And so a lot of these issues that you've been raising are issues that they need to fit into their current thinking about national treatment and most favored nations, of course, as well. And so there are some tensions in there that need to be put together as well. So these are certainly very interesting times to think about these issues. I've seen here in the chat a question that I'm going to read out, and then maybe we can discuss it. So one person said, it was discussed today that there is a need for more investments everywhere, domestic, international, especially for post-pandemic recovery. But is the supply side ready to take on these investments and deploy them in a sustainable way? So this is really a question about, we know that we need more investments into sustainability. Is the supply side, which often is a business community, ready to also jump into action?
Well, I think that one answer is that we see in the automobile industry that companies from Ford and GM and Toyota and Volkswagen, all the way to the tiny ones and the supplier component suppliers, are moving to produce cars that are electricity powered, instead of powered by internal combustion engines. And this is clearly totally in line with the Sustainable Development Goals. It's in line with the policy that China implemented unilaterally of requiring non-fossil fuel burning cars by 2030. And this seems to be getting taken up by other countries as well. So, I think it's very clear that policies can be implemented that get companies to move in the direction of sustainability. And maybe I wouldn't want to argue that the companies would have done it otherwise. I wouldn't want to say, if I think of General Motors, not to pick on GM, but a big car company that produces vehicles today, cars and trucks, would have switched to batteries if they weren't forced to. I don't think they would have. But if consumers or government regulators or both are saying we want non-gasoline powered cars or non-hydrocarbon powered cars, they'll do it. And so the instigation is there, the policy is there, the consumer reaction to some extent seems to be there. So boom, we've got a wonderful example of companies moving in the direction that we would like to see at the global level. And parenthetically, China is the leader in this area, and it's got General Motors and Volkswagen and others doing their electric vehicle research in China, which makes great sense since there's a agglomeration effect of that R&D activity in one place.
Yeah, so maybe if I can add to that, so we can also look at that same question a bit differently and ask, what can governments do to make sure that the supply side is ready to jump into action? And Rory Horner wrote an article a couple of years ago where he actually very nicely defined the 4 different roles that governments play as they are shaping international business and global value chains, which I think is useful here. So, because also when I was listening to the discussion today, some people, when they talk about investing in sustainability, they try to focus on how we can create new technologies. Other people, when they're focusing on investing in sustainability, are focusing on how to harness existing activities. So the 4 roles that Rory Horner put out is that the government plays the role of facilitating, regulating, producing, and buying. And all 4 can be used to try to influence the market. So the first role is indeed a role of facilitator. So what you can say is, okay, we need to invest more into sustainability, a bit in line with what you were saying, Rob. So if indeed we're making it more attractive for companies to develop new technologies, green technologies, by themselves through subsidies or other incentives, well, that can be one way that they will be more incentivized to create these new technologies. That's kind of one way. Another way is to say, well, what we need to do is we need to create some more regulation that prevents companies from doing things that leads to negative externalities. And so this could be, I mean, indeed kind of saying, look, we're going to prioritize investments that are not as polluting, or it can be an indication that companies now will become responsible for the waste that they generate, which is what happens in the white goods industry in the European Union. So this is really kind of saying, well, we're going to be constraining activity. It could also be related to this carbon border adjustment tax, where ultimately companies would have to pay a certain tax related to the carbon footprint that they are developing. So this is a very different way. There are 2 other ways actually that have been getting a little bit less attention, but actually, if we're seeing what people are talking about, we do see some more action in this respect. One is government as producers. We heard Fu Xiaolan in the previous section talking about a paper that is forthcoming in the Journal of International Business Policy, where there is this idea of creating international joint ventures to increase rapidly vaccine production. And so there is a discussion there about governments actually creating joint ventures with private companies. And so here what you have is governments stepping up and saying, okay, look, we are not doing good enough in the market in order to develop certain resiliencies or risk management practices. Let's have the government step in here and let them take over a little bit of that. And we're seeing a bit more calls of this in certain respect. And the other one that has gotten the least attention, but actually is a very powerful tool, is public procurement. So public procurement is a very big market.
Sure.
Very often right now, you have governments saying, we are going to do public procurement, but in order to be able to sell to us, you need to link your sales with production activities that have certain standards. And so you're seeing a lot of government intervention into markets actually going in this respect. And that could be another way that actually we can see a development of sustainability or resiliency through government action. One final thing I would kind of indicate there is, as we are thinking about all these different tools, what certainly policymakers need to do is talk to businesses. We often think that we know what businesses want, but it's not always as straightforward. So we might say businesses want facilitation, they hate regulation. That's a bit too simplistic a presentation of things. We had a very interesting intervention by Bruno Vermoosen from Recupel and BSH yesterday. And so what he indicated is, look, I mean, there's a lot of companies that when they are developing their strategy, they are thinking about the 4 Ps. So we heard earlier today the 3 Ps of people, planet, prosperity. Of course, companies also think about profits. So what he was saying is, look, a lot of companies are already thinking about how they can improve societal needs as well. The issue is that if these companies do it and other companies in the same market are not doing it, this creates an unlevel playing field. So a lot of companies, they do want to have some kind of regulation that allows them to have a more level playing field where they can do this action. So you can see here that again, some companies want some things, other companies want other things, but certainly all the policymakers out there talk to businesses and try to understand what they want, and it will often be much richer than we might be thinking as well. So I'll kind of leave it here. Amelia, did you want to add something there, or?
No, it's okay. I'm okay. Perhaps we can. I mean, there were some issues. Perhaps Rob, I don't know if you want to address this issue: how to link SMEs with big multinationals that link back to the GVC question.
SMEs, did you say?
Well, there was a question, yes, like
small and medium-sized companies,
small and medium enterprises, and the big MNEs.
Yeah, no, and that comes to that relates to the issue that was raised in the presentation about Africa, where the statement was we should see more effort to get companies across Africa to internationalize. And he said small and medium-sized enterprises. And I would hazard the argument that that's ridiculous. Small and medium-sized enterprises are not going to internationalize across Africa. The largest companies in South Africa and Nigeria are the ones that are going to internationalize across Africa, just the same as in the United States and Western Europe and elsewhere in the world. The SMEs can participate in global value chains, and so that's really important. And perhaps, I guess it was Ari said it a moment ago, if you can get government policy to encourage multinationals to include local SMEs in the value chain, in their value chains, then that absolutely is a useful direction. I recall in Honduras, the government encouraged and really didn't put too many hooks or claws in it, encouraged Walmart to buy from local suppliers. Well, come on, Honduras has a tiny number of people and companies. They can't supply Walmart's needs in any meaningful way, but they could for Walmart sales in Honduras. So that's exactly what they did. They find local suppliers for, generally speaking, low tech and raw material kind of products that they sell. And it worked nicely. And of course, you'd like to move up the value chain at some stage or in some way. But the point is, you can encourage, entice, force multinationals to link up more with small and medium-sized firms. But the reality in the U.S. and everywhere else is that the motor of growth is small and medium-sized enterprise. Everywhere, they're 80% or more of the companies in any country, and 3/4 or more of the total employment. So, I mean, these are a very important theme. These kinds of company are a very important theme, Amelia. But, what do you do to regulation-wise to encourage that sector or that type of company? It's quite problematic.
If I could just add to that, there have been some interesting policy initiatives that have tried to actually tackle these type of things. So by a number of export credit agencies, including Export Development Canada. Export Development Canada is trying to push Canadian firms to export. Like most export credit agencies, they've in the past focused primarily on giving financing deals or preferential loans to Canadian exporters, but they've also started to experiment with things which people call pull strategies, where they actually pull strategies instead of push strategies, pull strategies, where instead of giving financing possibilities to Canadian small and medium or larger exporters, they give financing possibilities to larger foreign multinational firms in the hope that this will encourage these larger multinational firms to consider small and medium enterprises from Canada as their suppliers. So the moment that you actually start thinking in global value chain terms, where you do know that these SMEs are linked towards larger firms, you actually do start finding out that there are some other creative ways to do this. I'll give you another example. So we like to focus on firms that export or do foreign direct investment as the firms that are doing international business. But actually, you've got in Canada and in any country around the world, a lot of companies that they themselves are not exporting or doing foreign direct investments, but their livelihood critically depends on international business because they are supplying to those bigger firms that are doing the exporting or the foreign direct investment. So when we're thinking actually about who we're trying to help with international business policies, oftentimes we're actually touching many more companies than we might think as well. And trying to develop these links and understand them is also something that is quite important. So
yeah, I think you need to get the SMEs involved with the big multinationals in some policy manner. But when I think of Exim Bank that you were talking about there, if you look at, I don't know if it's 50% of their loan portfolio, but a very large percent of Exim Bank's loan portfolio for supporting U.S. exports is made to Boeing, Caterpillar, and General Electric. And come on, those are not SMEs, but that's a huge percentage of the total lending done by the U.S. Export Bank. And this has been true for decades. Mm-hmm. So it's a real challenge. And weaving the SMEs into this process, man, is not easy at all. Yeah. And this is not saying it's hopeless. Just the same way, I'll put this one on Amelia. It's in the same sense. We used to say, well, there's not enough information, as Ari did a minute ago, about what companies are actually doing. We need more granular or more boots on the ground kind of information. Well, back in the olden days, all we had as far as information about direct investment is concerned is information from the United States Department of Commerce about U.S. companies aggregated at the industry level in 6 sectors and in about 30 countries around the world, now less than that originally. And it came to Carl Sovant and UNCTAD's Transnational Corporation Division to put pressure on governments to put more information out there, to collect more information and make it available about what's going on. And now we have much more detailed industry data. We don't have small and medium-sized enterprise data to any extent, but the more we academics can identify what information is needed, this is kind of why I'm going after Amelia, the more we can identify what's needed, the more we can try and get UNCTAD to help, and the U.S. Department of Commerce and other national groups too, to go collect the information that we want, not just because we want to write about it, but because it's important to understand, like you said a minute ago, Amelia, the gender issues. You know, how are we going to understand how many women are employed in a company if we don't ask what the answer is? Because it's not published in their annual reports.
No, thank you so much. I think this is very important. We had a symposium on statistics, but this is how to collaborate in our FBI statistics, our publication, how to have consistency. But there is data that we still don't have. And the only way to collect it is by doing surveys. And that's where the collaboration between international organizations, academia, industry works, because there is, as I said, you cannot find data in company reporting because they don't want to report it. So there is there is a policy issue to force them to report, but then there are issues that the only way that you can go is like what our colleagues that wrote the paper on Bangladesh, they did surveys of companies in Bangladesh that are engaged in supply chain, and they went there and collected data and followed them. So doing this multidimensional and longitudinal analysis requires time and resources. There is the data that is private, and there was another issue, the cost of some of this big data is very expensive. It's not a public good, so we really have to find a way of working together more and that's where the working with and I see a question about how we can train. I mean, it's beyond training the policymakers, is working with them to find solutions, research answers to their policy questions. So I think I will go a step ahead of beyond training and trying to have collaborative research projects. I remember when I was in the Central Bank of the Dominican Republic, we did our first social accounting matrix with NYU. New York University because they had a center. So we didn't have the institutional capacity to do it, and they helped us with the institutional capacity at the central bank. And then we did some census and some work. It was done at the central bank because they had the best technical team. We should have done that somewhere else. But there are examples like that, working together with international organizations, academia, and improving both national data, but also having more possibilities of doing survey type of analysis together.
You know, when we look at the services sector, which is in the United States, 80% of the overall economy, and in almost every country in the world, including emerging markets, services are over half of the total economy. We have very weak information about what the services companies spend their money on. For example, R&D. How do you define R&D? You know, in a bank or a hotel or some other service company, or a consulting company. I mean, it's just very difficult, but it's up to us academics to attack the issue and then recruit UNCTAD and national governments to say, hey, companies, we need this information. It's not that expensive to collect if we can identify exactly what we want. It can't be a fishing trip, but I think that there's, you know, great possibility to collect useful information that can help policymakers make better decisions. Well, we're running out of time here, it looks like. Amelia, do you have a closing thought?
So
well, we had a perfect comment from Jeremy Clegg, the former president of the Academy for International Business and a long-term collaborator of UNCTAD. I think these reflections, this daily run-up has helped us to go deeper into the cross-cutting issues and also the different communities that we had at the WIF. I think for me, I'm a true believer of collaboration between academia, international organizations, and governments. I have been on the three sectors, and I see the value of it. And I think it's time for us to come up with more questions together and apply them at the practical level, identify sectors, identify countries and issues. I mean, what Ari is doing in terms of GVCs for LDCs and the global governance system, how it is they affect the most vulnerable countries. These type of issues, we should work more together with academics as international organizations. We have the forum, we have World Investment Forum, MC12 is coming in December, we had UNCTAD 15, but then we need this type of a space to reflect and to inform our work with policymakers. So thank you very much. I'll stop here. As Ari said, we will have a collection of this daily run-up coming in transnational corporations. We will work out the way of putting them in a way that is interesting for policymakers, academic, and business sectors alike. But over to you, Ari, and thank you so much, Rob, Ari, and
thanks, Ari.
And all
thanks, Amelia.
that contributed.
So thank you very much, Amelia, and thanks, Rob, for being on this panel. So indeed, I've thoroughly enjoyed the whole World Investment Forum. I found that the discussions are very much aligned to discussions that we're having in academic circles as well. We're all worried about what the future will hold. We're all trying to find creative solutions to it. We're looking at it from different viewpoints, but this is a type of forums where we can actually find ways how there can be a convergence in these views. And so I would like to thank Amelia and Richard and James for all you've done to set up this wonderful conference. There is one more day coming. Yes. I've already have a whole agenda of things I'll be doing tomorrow early in the morning. So, but all of you, as I say in every session, this is only a session in a conference, is only a snapshot. If you want to continue having discussions about these issues with me or with Rob or with Amelia, then please reach out to us. So this is what we are passionate about, and we love having discussions about. So reach out and continue the discussion. But this session will finalize here, though. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ari and Rob, and all that.
Thanks, Ari.
Thank you.
Thanks, Amelia. Bye-bye.